Buddhism and politics are separate. No, Buddhism and politics are inseparable. That was the debate I saw in the late 80s at the Philadelphia Shambhala Center. So I think the latter has turned out to be true and really in line with the teachings. So I wanted to make an addendum video looking at tribalism and social identity theory from a Buddhist perspective. So during Buddha's time, society in India was divided up into a caste system with 4 primary castes and then outcasts. And this was understood as the cosmic order. There was no question, it was unquestionable. It was a kind of a meta narrative that almost everyone saw as true. But Buddha's teachings really undermine this worldview. And you can see why people didn't like it, particularly the people in power. It was a challenge to their authority, although Buddha didn't teach physical revolution, kind of more of a revolution of the mind and of the spirit. So in many sutras and in many legends and stories and parables of Buddha, you will hear Buddha talking about things related to identity, polarization, tribalism. So in some way, he argues that really how one is holy is not by birth or wealth or the things they have, but really by one's actions. And everyone is capable of acting constructively or destructively. Now, I put a few different texts in here that you can review, which I found really, really interesting and interesting to consider how these apply to our current times. So after 49 days of enlightenment, Buddha decided must come back to the world and opened up and started creating a Sangha and welcomed everybody of all castes, genders, and background. It was very radical because in those days, institutions never broke caste barriers. One of the famous stories is Upali, who was a barber, became the chief of monastic life under Buddha. Now, while race isn't in these early texts or conceived of at that time in India, they did conceive of, and part of Indian society was gender non-conforming individuals who were often marginalized in Indian society of that time, but welcomed into the Sangha. So Buddha allowed ordination of women, although he did put restrictive rules that were somewhat in line of the patriarchal norms of India at that time. Kathagatama was one of the early female teachers and is used to kind of illustrate that suffering happens to all individuals. An interesting article by Dr. Kuklaskas and Dr. Olson using that parable and comparing and contrasting Buddhist ideas with existential psychology ideas. I found this story, I would recommend reading it, very, very moving, very compassion building. So as Buddhism spread throughout the East, it was going into countries and cultures with a lot of patriarchy. And you still see, when I go and have an opportunity to teach in Asia and meet with either professors or monks or Buddhist teachers, that depending upon their context and their tradition, they'll be more open-minded or more closed-minded, still with elements of discrimination, I think would be the easiest way to say it. So the early Sangha was really seen as, a countercultural refuge. People would come who didn't fit into Indian society and didn't find satisfaction with it, right? There's stories of Sangha members and deities changing sex within lifetimes and across lifetimes. Avalokitesvara is seen as a support contemporarily for gender expansive individuals of being represented in both genders or beyond gender or with both genders. And many, many contemporary Buddhist teachers, particularly in the West, have have a variety of diverse identities and non-dominant identities. So how does all this connect to some of the core teachings here? So generally, the idea is that identities are really impermanent, conditioned, or socially constructed in some way, and that the self is not fixed, but ever changing. So if you were to give yourself a label or give other people a label, that will eventually fade away due to impermanence. So the modern interpretations of this is that it is really welcoming of all identities. I thought a fascinating story to follow was when Sensei Reed was coming out as being non-binary, and the variety of pressures, criticism that they had to face. And it seems like it worked out, but a real courageous story, I think, that shows how far Buddhism has come in terms of inclusiveness. I'd also highly recommend Dr. Rivers Fleming's dissertation was about brilliant sanity through the perspective of non-binary identity. Such a wealth of knowledge and wisdom I find in Dr. Fleming. So in Buddhist idea, basically prejudice is seen as delusion. You're not seeing the world accurately in some way, and also very much founded in kind of self-preservation and almost ego, conceit, right? So Buddha brought this with, trying to break through caste arrogance, gender bias, the ethnic pride, the caste pride, and really, when you get through bias and prejudice, you have to get rid of those afflictions in order to move along the path in some way. So I like this quote I was able to work with and edit this work by Reverend Angel Williams. Liberation is for all, not just for our friends or for those we like, but for all. Really driving home that point. So there's a variety of practices in Buddhism that kind of address this idea of tribalism and bias. So Tonglen practice would be one of these, where we're exchanging ourselves for others, potentially others with different identities or in different tribes. We're imagining giving them happiness. We're imagining taking on their suffering, right? This is seen in some explorations of Tonglen practice as challenges that kind of being your self-preference, your ego, and your privilege. There's lots of Lojong sayings that have been interpreted through a social justice lens. Given an example of a couple, consider all beings as your mother. So kind of treating everyone with the care that you might give your mother or a mother who took care of a very helpless, very needy, very dependent infant. And this is supposed to help erode in-group and out-group biases and drive all blames into one. So this focuses on not finding the causal issues out there, but kind of self-reflection, and really kind of undermines a very common dynamic in our culture of scapegoating and othering others. So I put a collection of quotes here. Basically, how one acts is really very, very important, and that hatred doesn't get cured by more hatred, but cured by love. And that I think this is hopeful that all things are impermanent and can eventually improve or get better. I love the, in a forward to Brilliant Sanity about our program, Panla Rinpoche writes that really positive change in the world is like a grain of sand holding up against basically a tsunami wave. And it may not work, but it might. And we have to bring that kind of hope into our everyday world and into our interactions with others in some way. So identity, how we define ourselves, is really seen as an obstacle. All the social groups that we put ourselves in, they are all relative and contextual and probably beneficial and limiting in some ways, but it's not the ultimate truth here. And the idea is that through practice, really over time, these kind of self and other distinctions loosen and lessen. And as we practice, and depending on the variety of practices we do, our different states of consciousness or just slowing down will allow kind of us to critically examine our old ways of thinking, and kind of also potentially allow a broader, more compassionate paradigms to come in. So many Buddhist teachers now, I think, apply the Dharma to racism, sexism, classism, tribalism, bias, oppression, social justice, and bias is generally understood as being ignorant, or it's one of the three passions. So I think one of the core ideas of Buddhism is, there's right view and there's right speech, but I wanted to highlight right action here. And what is right action potentially in terms of being a counseling student in a world full of polarization and tribalism, in a world that's facing ecological disaster? So I don't have the answers, but these would be questions, right? Is kindness and inclusion the right action? Is being vulnerable and admitting mistakes the right action? How about highlighting how you see things differently with others? Would that be the right action? Right? How about having containment over your feelings and your impulses, having patience, and being able to kind of strategically plan how to proceed in a challenging situation that could be an opportunity, right? Maybe being politically involved is a right action, or maybe studying hard as a counseling student. Maybe that's the right action. How about expanding your social circle to include those who are different? Or loving the earth, refrain, recycle, reuse? I guess the question would be, what is right action at this moment? How do you see it? And how about at the next moment? And then potentially you can consider the privileges, the gifts you have in this world, in this contemporary context, and maybe how can you use them as a way towards liberation for all? So I feel that the Buddhist text, the Buddhist lineage, from its very foundations to contemporary culture, really kind of address many of the challenges that are seen in our contemporary cultural context. And I'll be curious to if you see it similarly or differently. And I wish you the best.